Sarah gently tried to pull her wrist free from Mark's grip, maintaining her composure despite the growing fear in her chest. Around them, the party continued, but a few people had started to notice the tense exchange in the corner. The soft music playing in the background seemed to fade as Mark's anger became more visible. "Let's step outside," Mark demanded, his voice growing louder. Several heads turned in their direction. "We need to settle this now." Sarah straightened her spine and spoke firmly, though her heart was racing. "No, Mark. I'm not leaving my own celebration. Please let go of my wrist. You're hurting me." James from HR had already risen from his seat and was slowly making his way toward them. He worked as a domestic abuse counselor before joining the corporate world, and something about Mark's body language set off alarm bells in his mind. Mark released Sarah's wrist but stepped closer to her, his tall frame towering over her petite figure. "You've changed," he spat out. "Ever since you started climbing the corporate ladder, you've forgotten your place. What kind of wife puts her career before her family?" "A successful one," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I can be both a good wife and a successful professional. They're not mutually exclusive." The music had stopped for dinner announcements, making their conversation audible to nearby tables. Sarah's colleague Jennifer watched with concern, her phone discreetly recording under the table. Something about the situation felt wrong, and her instincts told her to document it. "I gave you everything," Mark continued, his voice rising. "A beautiful house, expensive clothes, vacations, and this is how you repay me? By embarrassing me in front of all these people, acting like you're some independent woman who doesn't need her husband." Sarah felt her face flush with both anger and embarrassment. "I never asked for those things, Mark. I wanted a partnership, not a cage. And yes, I am an independent woman. That's who you married." More people were watching now. David, Sarah's supervisor, had signaled to security, who were quietly positioning themselves near the scene. The tension in the room was palpable. "You know what your problem is?" Mark's words were slightly slurred from the whiskey. "You've let all this success go to your head. These people filling it with ideas about women's empowerment and career growth, they're ruining you, ruining us." Sarah looked around the room, seeing the concerned faces of her colleagues. She'd hidden the problems in her marriage for so long, always making excuses for Mark's controlling behavior. But something about this moment, perhaps the public setting, perhaps the alcohol making him show his true colors, made her realize she couldn't keep pretending. "There is no us to ruin if you can't accept me as an equal," she said clearly. "I love my job, I'm good at it, and I won't quit. Not now, not ever." The color drained from Mark's face, replaced by a dangerous flush. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're my wife," he growled. "You'll do as I say." "No, Mark. Those days are over. I'm not just your wife, I'm my own person, and if you can't accept that, then maybe we need to." She never finished her sentence. The room seemed to freeze as Mark's right hand rose, his wedding ring catching the light. Several people gasped, realizing what was about to happen but too far away to intervene. James was running now, but he wouldn't make it in time. Jennifer's phone was still recording. David was shouting for security. But everything seemed to move in slow motion as Mark's control finally snapped completely. The evening had started as a celebration of professional achievement, but it was about to become something else entirely. In the next few seconds, Mark would make a decision that would not only destroy his marriage but would also spark a conversation that would ripple through the corporate world about domestic violence and women's rights in the workplace. The tension had reached its breaking point, and as Sarah stood her ground, she had no idea that her next words would trigger a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of countless others who would later hear her story. The sound of Mark's hand striking Sarah's face echoed through the ballroom like a thunderclap. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The music died. Glasses froze mid-clink, every eye in the room fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Sarah staggered backward, her hand rising to her reddening cheek. The shock in her eyes reflected in the horrified faces of everyone watching. Her carefully styled hair had come loose, and a thin trickle of blood appeared at the corner of her mouth, where her lip had split against her teeth. "How dare you?" Mark shouted, his face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful!" Before he could finish or move toward her again, James finally reached them. In one fluid motion, he positioned himself between Sarah and Mark. Other men from nearby tables quickly joined him, forming a human barrier. The security guards who had been approaching broke into a run. Jennifer rushed to Sarah's side, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. The phone in her hand was still recording, capturing evidence that would later prove crucial. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hand still pressed to her face, as if her mind couldn't quite process what had just happened. "Get him out of here." David's voice boomed across the room. He had reached them now too, his face flushed with anger. The security guards grabbed Mark's arms, but he struggled against their hold. "She's my wife," Mark shouted, trying to shake off the guards. "This is between us. You have no right to interfere." The CEO of the company, Patricia Wilson, who had been watching events unfold from the head table, stood up. Her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Take him to the police officers outside. We had them stationed there for event security." Her tone left no room for argument. As the guards dragged Mark toward the exit, he continued shouting, "Sarah, don't you dare think this is over. You're nothing without me. Nothing." The room erupted in murmurs and movement. Some people pulled out their phones to call the police themselves. Others gathered around Sarah, offering support and tissues. A woman who identified herself as a nurse gently examined Sarah's face. Through it all, Sarah hadn't said a word. She stood there, surrounded by concerned colleagues, her mind racing through 6 years of marriage. The controlling behavior she'd excused, the subtle threats she'd ignored, the gradual isolation from friends and family. It all led to this moment, this public unmasking of who Mark really was. Patricia Wilson made her way through the crowd, her expression both concerned and determined. "Sarah," she said softly, "the police will want to speak with you. We have multiple witnesses and," she glanced at Jennifer, who nodded, confirming she had video evidence. Finally, Sarah spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I never thought. I knew he was controlling, but I never thought he'd." "It's not your fault," James said firmly. "None of this is your fault." Sarah looked around the room, at the faces of her colleagues, people she saw every day but had kept at a distance because Mark didn't approve of work friendships. She saw concern in their eyes, but also strength and support. No judgment, no blame, just pure human compassion. "I need to make a statement," Sarah said suddenly, straightening her shoulders. "You don't have to," Jennifer started, but Sarah shook her head. "Yes, I do. For every woman who's ever been told to choose between her career and her marriage. For every woman who's been made to feel small for having ambitions. I need to do this." The police had arrived now, their blue lights flashing through the ballroom windows. Outside, they could hear Mark's continued shouting as he was placed under arrest, but inside, something remarkable was happening. Sarah Chen, her cheeks still red from her husband's strike, was about to transform a moment of violence into something powerful. As she stepped toward the microphone that had been used earlier for speeches, the room fell silent again. No one could have predicted that this corporate celebration would become the setting for such a dramatic scene. But as Sarah took a deep breath, preparing to speak, it was clear that this was more than just a domestic dispute gone public. This was about to become a moment that would inspire and empower others to speak their truth. The ballroom fell silent as Sarah stepped up to the microphone. Her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted it, but her voice rang out clear and strong when she began to speak. The bruise on her cheek was beginning to darken, but there was a fire in her eyes that commanded attention. "I've spent years making myself smaller," she began, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "Years apologizing for my success, hiding my achievements, and pretending to be less than I am, all to protect a man's ego." A police officer stood quietly by the door, notepad in hand, while another spoke with Jennifer about the video evidence. But most eyes were fixed on Sarah, whose voice grew stronger with each word. "Tonight, my husband showed you all who he really is. What you saw, that violence, that rage, didn't appear out of nowhere. It started with small things. Checking my phone, questioning my late meetings, suggesting I was being unfaithful when I traveled for work." Several women in the audience nodded, recognition dawning in their eyes. Patricia Wilson, the CEO, stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed, listening intently. "He'd tell me I was lucky to have him, that no other man would put up with a career woman. He'd remind me that he made enough money for both of us, that wanting my own career was selfish." Sarah paused, touching her bruised cheek. I believed him. I started to think maybe I was being selfish. James, the former abuse counselor, watched with professional recognition. He'd seen this pattern before: the gradual erosion of confidence, the subtle manipulation, the eventual explosion of violence. But looking at all of you now, Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping the room, I see what I couldn't see before. I see strong women who balance families and careers. I see men who support their partners' ambitions instead of feeling threatened by them. I see what a healthy workplace looks like, and I realize how toxic my home life had become. Jennifer wiped tears from her eyes, still holding her phone that contained the damning evidence. Other women in the room had started to cry too, some reaching for their colleagues' hands. To anyone who's ever felt like they had to choose between their safety and their success, between their marriage and their ambition, you don't. You deserve both. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to succeed. You deserve to shine. Sarah's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. Tonight, my husband tried to shame me in front of my colleagues. Instead, he exposed himself. He thought he would silence me. Instead, he gave me my voice back. The police officer who had been taking notes looked up, clearly moved by Sarah's words. Patricia Wilson had made her way to the front of the room, ready to support Sarah when she finished. I don't know what happens next, Sarah admitted, her honesty touching everyone in the room. I'm scared. I'm hurt. But for the first time in years, I'm also free. Free to be myself, free to succeed, free to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. She straightened her shoulders, standing taller. So thank you, Mark, she said, her voice taking on a strength that surprised even her. Thank you for showing everyone exactly why I need my career, my independence, and my voice. Thank you for proving that I'm stronger than you ever thought I was. The room erupted in applause. Women and men alike stood, some wiping tears, others nodding in fierce approval. Patricia Wilson stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. As Sarah stepped away from the microphone, people began approaching her, not with pity, but with respect and solidarity. Some shared their own stories in hushed voices. Others offered practical help, names of lawyers, safe houses, support groups. The police were ready to take her statement, and Jennifer had already sent the video evidence to Sarah's email for safekeeping. But something had shifted in the room, something bigger than one woman's personal tragedy. Sarah's courage in speaking out had created a ripple effect that would continue long after the bruises faded. As the evening drew to a close, it was clear that this was not just about domestic violence or career choices. It was about breaking silence, finding strength in community, and refusing to let fear win. Sarah Chen had walked into the ballroom that evening as a victim, but she would walk out as something else entirely, a survivor ready to help others find their voice. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Sarah sat in Patricia Wilson's private office, surrounded by a team of people dedicated to helping her navigate the aftermath of last night's events. Her cheek had turned a deep purple, but her eyes were clear and determined. We've already contacted the best divorce attorney in the city, Patricia said, sliding a business card across her mahogany desk. Linda Chen, no relation to you, specializes in cases involving domestic violence. She's waiting for your call. James, who had arrived early to offer his expertise as a former abuse counselor, spoke up. The police have Mark in custody, but he'll likely make bail soon. We need to focus on your immediate safety. Sarah nodded, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The events of the previous night felt almost surreal, like watching a movie of someone else's life. Yet the ache in her face served as a constant reminder that it had all been terrifyingly real. Your video has gone viral, Jennifer said quietly, showing Sarah her phone. The clip of Mark's attack and Sarah's subsequent speech had spread across social media overnight. #StandWithSarah was trending, with thousands sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination and domestic abuse. I never meant to become the face of this issue, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. A gentle knock on the door interrupted them. David, Sarah's supervisor, entered with a stack of papers. The security team has already changed all the access codes in the building, he reported. We've also hired additional security personnel. Mark won't be able to get anywhere near you at work. Sarah's phone buzzed continuously with messages from friends and family who had seen the video. Many expressed shock. Mark had always been so charming in public, so good at maintaining his image. Others shared guilt about not noticing the signs earlier. My mother wants me to move back home, Sarah said, scrolling through her messages. But I won't run away. I won't let him drag me from my job, my home, my life. Patricia leaned forward, her expression serious. Sarah, I want you to know that the company stands behind you completely. We're not just talking about security measures. We want to make this a catalyst for change. She pulled out a proposal document. We're launching a comprehensive workplace safety initiative, domestic violence awareness training, resources for employees in abusive situations, partnerships with local shelters and support organizations. And we want you to help shape it, if you're willing. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the document. For years, Mark had tried to make her feel powerless, but here was an opportunity to turn her pain into purpose. There's more, Jennifer added. Remember those international expansion plans you mentioned last night? The board has fast-tracked them. They want you to lead the project. Full creative control, your own team, everything you've worked for. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but these were different from the tears she'd shed in fear over the years. These were tears of relief, of possibility, of strength found in solidarity. The phone on Patricia's desk buzzed. Her assistant's voice came through. Ms. Wilson, there are reporters in the lobby. They're requesting statements about last night's incident. Sarah straightened in her chair. I'll speak to them, she said firmly. Are you sure? James asked. You don't owe anyone your story. No, I don't, Sarah agreed. But there are women out there right now, sitting in their offices or homes, feeling trapped like I was. If my story helps even one of them find the courage to leave, to speak up, to reclaim their power, then it's worth telling. As she stood to face the media, Sarah caught her reflection in Patricia's office window. The bruise on her face would fade, but the strength she'd found would remain. Mark had tried to silence her, to dim her light, to force her to choose between her safety and her success. Instead, he had inadvertently helped her find her voice, her purpose, and a community of supporters who understood that a woman's worth wasn't measured by her willingness to make herself small. Walking toward the elevator with her impromptu support team, Sarah realized that sometimes the worst moments in life become catalysts for the best changes. Her story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The press conference room buzzed with energy as Sarah Chen faced a wall of cameras and reporters. 4 days had passed since the incident, and her story had exploded across national media. The bruise on her face was still visible, but she had chosen not to cover it with makeup. It was part of her truth now. Ms. Chen, how does it feel to become a symbol of workplace empowerment overnight? A reporter called out. Sarah gripped the podium, her new lawyer Linda Chen standing supportively at her side. I never intended to become a symbol of anything, she began. I was simply a woman who refused to choose between her safety and her career. But the response to my story has shown me how many others are facing the same impossible choice. The room fell silent as Sarah shared new details about her marriage to Mark. She described the gradual erosion of her independence, the subtle threats, the constant pressure to quit her job. As she spoke, phones buzzed throughout the room with breaking news. Mark had just been formally charged with assault and battery. We've received reports that your husband has been released on bail, another reporter said. Are you afraid? Linda Chen stepped forward to intercept the question, but Sarah raised her hand. Yes, I am afraid, she admitted. But I'm no longer alone. The support I've received from my company, my colleagues, and countless strangers has shown me that fear doesn't have to control my life. Patricia Wilson, sitting in the front row, nodded approvingly. The company's response had made headlines of its own. They had not only strengthened their workplace safety policies, but had also established a foundation to help domestic violence survivors rebuild their careers. Can you tell us about the flood of messages you've received? Asked a female reporter from the back. Sarah's eyes softened. In the past 4 days, I've received over 10,000 messages from women around the world. They've shared their stories of surviving abuse, of fighting for their careers, of finding their voice. Each message reminds me that what happened at that party wasn't just about me. It was about breaking a cycle of silence. The corporate communications team had prepared a statement for her, but Sarah had set it aside. Her words came from the heart as she continued. Yesterday, I received a message from a young executive in Singapore. She wrote that watching my speech gave her the courage to leave her abusive partner of 8 years. She's now working with her company to establish similar safety protocols. Linda Chen then took the microphone to address the legal aspects. The restraining order against Mark had been granted, and civil proceedings were underway, but the story had grown beyond a single legal case. Ms. Chen will be testifying before the state legislature next month, Linda announced. Her experiences sparked a crucial conversation about workplace protections for domestic violence survivors. As the press conference concluded, Sarah's phone lit up with a message that made her pause. It was from Mark's mother. "I saw the bruises on your face. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have spoken up years ago when I saw how he treated you. I'm testifying against him. It's time the truth came out." Back in Patricia's office afterward, Sarah finally allowed herself to exhale. The past few days had been a whirlwind of police statements, legal meetings, and media interviews. But something unexpected had emerged from the chaos, a sense of purpose. "The Asian market expansion project starts next week," Patricia reminded her gently. "Are you still up for leading it?" Sarah thought about Mark's attempts to diminish her ambitions, to keep her small and dependent. She thought about the thousands of women who had reached out, sharing their own stories of resilience. She thought about the young girls who might see her story and learn early that their dreams deserved to be fought for. "Absolutely," Sarah replied, her voice strong and clear. "But I'd like to add something to the project scope. In each market we enter, I want to partner with local organizations that support working women and domestic violence survivors." Patricia smiled, sliding over the project documents. "I was hoping you'd say that. Your experience has taught us all something important. Success shouldn't require silence, and safety shouldn't come at the cost of ambition." As Sarah began reviewing the documents, she realized that her husband's attempt to destroy her had instead unleashed a power he never knew she possessed. The power to turn personal pain into positive change, not just for herself, but for women everywhere who deserve both success and safety. 1 month after the incident, Sarah stood at the entrance of her former home, accompanied by 2 police officers and a moving crew. The court had granted her permission to collect her belongings while Mark was required to stay away due to the restraining order. As she turned the key in the lock, memories flooded back, both good and bad. The house that had once been her prison now felt strangely small. The moving crew worked efficiently, following her instructions about which items to pack and which to leave behind. "Ms. Chen," one of the officers called out, holding up a stack of papers found in Mark's home office. "You might want to see this." Sarah approached cautiously. The papers revealed Mark's systematic efforts to control their finances. Hidden accounts, transferred assets, and detailed plans to make her financially dependent on him. Among them was a drafted resignation letter in her name, dated for the week after the party. "He was planning this all along," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling slightly. "He was going to force me to quit one way or another." Linda Chen, her lawyer, who had insisted on being present, quickly documented everything. "This is excellent evidence for the divorce proceedings," she noted, photographing each page. "Financial abuse is often overlooked in domestic violence cases." Meanwhile, across town, Thompson and Brooks Marketing had transformed. The company's new domestic violence awareness program, spearheaded by Sarah, had become a model for other corporations. James, using his background in abuse counseling, helped develop training programs that were now mandatory for all employees. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. "Turn on the news now." On her phone screen, Sarah watched as Mark appeared in court for his preliminary hearing. But what happened next stunned everyone. 3 women from his past stepped forward, revealing similar patterns of abuse and control. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "I need a moment," Sarah told the officers, stepping onto the back porch. The garden she had once tended so carefully was overgrown now. Like her marriage, it had been beautiful on the surface but hiding darker truths underneath. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Patricia Wilson. "The Singapore office is ready for you next week. Your story has already opened doors we didn't even know existed." The Asian expansion project had taken on new meaning. Companies in each target market had reached out, not just for business partnerships, but to learn from Sarah's experience in creating safer workplaces for women. Back inside, the moving crew had nearly finished. Sarah walked through each room one last time, remembering the woman who had lived here, the one who made herself small, who apologized for her success, who lived in fear of her husband's moods. In the master bedroom, she found her old diary hidden behind some books. Reading her entries from just a few months ago, she barely recognized her own voice. So hesitant, so afraid, so unsure. "Ms. Chen," the moving crew chief called out, "we're ready when you are." Sarah took one last look around. On the bedside table, she noticed her wedding photo. The smile on her face looked forced now that she knew what lay ahead for that hopeful bride. She left the photo where it was. That chapter of her life was over. Outside, a small group of neighbors had gathered. Instead of the judgment she had feared, she saw support in their eyes. One elderly woman approached her with tears streaming down her face. "I heard the fights," she admitted. "I saw the signs but said nothing. I'm so sorry, dear. But what you did, speaking up like that, you taught us all something important." As the moving truck pulled away, Sarah didn't look back. Her phone was already filling with messages about next week's Singapore trip, about the legislative hearing where she would testify, about the support groups wanting her to speak. Linda touched her arm gently. "Ready for your new life?" Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I've been ready for years," she replied. "I just didn't know it until now." The media would later call it the Chen effect, the ripple of change that started with one woman refusing to be silenced. But for Sarah, it was simpler than that. It was about finally understanding that her worth wasn't determined by her husband's approval or her willingness to shrink herself. As she drove away from her old house for the last time, Sarah realized that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted opens the door to everything you were meant to become. 1 year later, Sarah Chen stood at a podium in New York City, addressing the United Nations Women's Conference. The audience included business leaders, activists, and survivors from around the world. "When my husband struck me that night," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "he thought he was ending my career. Instead, he sparked a movement that has changed thousands of lives." In the front row sat Patricia Wilson, who had flown in from Singapore, where she was overseeing the company's massively successful Asian expansion. Next to her was Jennifer, whose video evidence had helped secure Mark's conviction 6 months earlier. He was now serving a 3-year sentence, with mandatory counseling. The Foundation for Workplace Safety has now helped over 5,000 women escape abusive situations while maintaining their careers. Sarah continued, gesturing to the statistics on the screen behind her. What started as one company's response to a crisis has become a global initiative. The foundation, born from Sarah's experience, had grown beyond anyone's expectations. It provided legal support, career counseling, and emergency assistance to women facing similar situations. Companies worldwide had adopted their workplace safety protocols. James, who had become the Foundation's chief counselor, smiled from his seat. He remembered the trembling woman from that party a year ago. Now she commanded the room with quiet confidence, her story transforming from one of victimhood to empowerment. "But the numbers tell only part of the story," Sarah said, pulling out a letter. "This morning, I received this from a young executive in Brazil," she writes. "Watching you stand up that night gave me courage. Today, I'm not just safe, I'm thriving. My daughters will grow up knowing they never have to choose between success and safety." The audience burst into applause. Among them was Mark's mother, who had become one of the Foundation's strongest supporters, speaking out about recognizing the early signs of abusive behavior. Sarah's personal life had transformed as well. The divorce was finalized, and she had found peace in her independence. Her role as executive director of international markets allowed her to combine her business acumen with her passion for helping others. The Chen effect, as some have called it, isn't about me, Sarah continued. It's about breaking the silence that allows abuse to thrive. It's about creating workplaces where women can succeed without fear. It's about transforming pain into purpose. Linda Chen, who had become both her lawyer and close friend, watched proudly from the sidelines. The legal precedents set by Sarah's case had helped strengthen workplace protections for domestic violence survivors across multiple states. After the speech, at a small gathering of Foundation supporters, Sarah shared more personal news. She was launching a mentorship program for young professional women, teaching them to recognize red flags in relationships and maintain their independence. "Sometimes," she told the group, "the most powerful thing we can do is simply show others what's possible. When one woman stands up, she gives permission for others to do the same. The Foundation's latest initiative, a partnership with major corporations to provide emergency job transfers for employees fleeing abuse, had already saved numerous lives. What had started with one company's response to a crisis had become a model for workplace safety worldwide. As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped out onto the balcony of the UN building, looking over the New York skyline. Jennifer joined her, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Did you ever imagine, that night at the party, that this would be your life a year later? Jennifer asked, handing her a glass. Sarah shook her head, smiling. I thought I was losing everything. Instead, I found my purpose. Inside, the conference participants were still discussing the day's presentations. The Chen Effect had become more than a hashtag. It was a movement, a shift in how corporations and society viewed the intersection of domestic violence and women's careers. To courage, Jennifer proposed a toast. To transformation, Sarah added, clinking their glasses. As they looked out over the city lights, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, and all the women still living in fear. Her story had shown them that speaking up wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The Foundation's next project was already in development. A global network of safe workplaces, ensuring that no woman would have to choose between her safety and her success. What had started with one terrible night at a company party had become a worldwide movement for change. Sarah Chen had lost her marriage, but she had found her mission. And in that transformation, she had helped countless others find their voice, their strength, and their way to freedom.